The slap came so fast I did not even raise my hands. One moment I was standing beside my attorney in a quiet county courtroom, 8 months pregnant, one hand resting over the place where my baby had just kicked. The next moment my husband's mistress had crossed the aisle and struck me across the face in front of the judge, the clerk, 2 attorneys and half a dozen strangers waiting for their own hearings. My cheek burned, my ears rang. Vanessa stood there in her cream-colored suit, red lips curled into a smile, looking at me as if I were something she had scraped off the bottom of her shoe. Then she leaned close enough for me to smell her perfume and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Even your baby can't make him stay." Nobody moved at first. Not even Ryan. My husband, though, by then, that word felt more like a wound than a title, sat at the other table with his hands folded in front of him. He did not look shocked. He did not look ashamed. He simply looked tired, as if my humiliation was an inconvenience delaying his new life. I took one step backward. My attorney, Margaret Hale, caught my elbow. "Emily," she whispered, "sit down." But I could not sit. Not yet. I was too busy trying to breathe. The courtroom seemed smaller than it had a minute earlier. The wood-paneled walls, the flag behind the bench, the framed state seal above Judge Harrison's chair, all of it blurred around the edges. I had spent the whole morning telling myself to stay calm. I had ironed my navy maternity dress the night before. I had packed crackers and water in my purse. I had even placed a tiny folded ultrasound photo in the side pocket, like a reminder that no matter what happened, I was not truly alone. And still there I was slapped in open court by the woman my husband had chosen over me. Judge Harrison's gavel came down so hard that everyone jumped. "That is enough." His voice was not loud, but it carried the kind of authority that filled the room. Vanessa stepped back, suddenly aware that she had gone too far. Ryan finally turned his head toward her, his jaw tight. "Your Honor," Margaret said, standing straighter now given what just occurred and given the emergency documents received by my office at 6:12 this morning, "I request permission to submit new financial evidence immediately." Ryan's attorney shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We are here for final disposition, not a surprise evidentiary hearing." Judge Harrison looked at Margaret. "What kind of evidence?" Margaret opened a slim folder from her briefcase. Her hands were steady, mine were not. "Records suggesting deliberate concealment of marital assets, falsified company debts, and sworn financial statements that may have misled this court." The room changed. I felt it before I understood it. The whispers stopped. Even Vanessa's face lost some of its smugness. Ryan leaned toward his attorney and whispered something urgent. His attorney did not answer right away. He was staring at the folder in Margaret's hand. Judge Harrison removed his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, then put them back on. "Approach." Both attorneys stepped forward. I sat slowly, one hand on the table, one hand over my belly. My son kicked again, not hard, but enough to remind me he was still there, still safe, still depending on me to be stronger than I felt. Across the aisle, Vanessa stared at me. The contempt was still there, but under it now was something new. Fear. Judge Harrison reviewed the first page, then the second, then he stopped. His expression did not explode, it tightened. That was worse. He looked at Ryan, then at Vanessa, then back at the papers. "Mr. Carter," he said, "are these signatures yours?" Ryan swallowed. "I would need to review them with counsel." That was not my question. Ryan's attorney touched his sleeve and whispered, "Don't answer." Judge Harrison closed the folder. For a moment no one breathed. Then he turned to the courtroom deputy. "Clear the courtroom." A murmur rose behind me. The judge continued. "All spectators will leave immediately. This matter will proceed under seal until I determine the scope of the alleged financial misconduct and whether there has been a fraud upon the court." Vanessa's mouth opened. "Under seal, what does that mean?" No one answered her. The deputy moved toward the back rows. Chairs scraped, people gathered purses and coats. A woman near the aisle looked at me with pity, and for the first time that morning it did not embarrass me. It steadied me. Because suddenly this was no longer only about a broken marriage. It was about what Ryan had tried to bury before walking away. As the courtroom emptied, Ryan finally looked at me. Not with love, not with regret, with warning. And that was when I understood something I should have seen long before. My husband had not just left me. He had planned to erase me. The ride home from the courthouse felt longer than the 40 minutes it actually took. I drove with both hands gripping the steering wheel while Margaret sat beside me reviewing notes on her tablet. Outside, late October sunlight spilled across the highway. Trees flashed gold and red beyond the guardrails. It should have been beautiful. Instead, I felt exhausted. The adrenaline from the courtroom had finally worn off, leaving behind a deep ache in my chest. For months, I had convinced myself that the divorce was about an affair. I thought Ryan had simply fallen in love with someone else. That hurt enough. But what happened in court suggested something far worse. "You're awfully quiet," Margaret said. I managed a weak smile. "I'm trying to catch up." "With what?" "Everything." She nodded. "That's fair." For several miles, neither of us spoke. Then I finally asked the question that had been sitting in my mind all afternoon. "How bad is it?" Margaret looked out the window before answering. "I don't know yet." "That's lawyer language." "It is." I laughed softly despite myself. Then she grew serious. "Emily, if those records are legitimate, this stopped being an ordinary divorce months ago." My stomach tightened. The baby shifted again. I rubbed my belly. "What exactly did Ryan do?" "We'll know more after we review everything." "Margaret," she sighed. "I think he may have spent the last year preparing to leave you with almost nothing." The words landed harder than Vanessa's slap. Because deep down I already knew they were probably true. The signs had been there. I simply hadn't wanted to see them. 3 years earlier, life looked very different. Ryan and I had been married for 11 years. We weren't rich. We weren't glamorous. But we were happy. At least I thought we were. We lived in a modest home outside Columbus, Ohio. Ryan owned a small construction company. I worked as an accountant for a manufacturing supplier. Most evenings were simple. Dinner. Television. Paying bills. Talking about the future. When Ryan decided to start his own business, I supported him completely. I believed in him. Maybe more than he believed in himself. The first 2 years were difficult. There were months when we barely stayed afloat. More than once I used money from my personal savings to cover payroll. When things became desperate, I used part of the inheritance my father had left me after his death. Nearly $70,000. Every penny went into Ryan's company. I never considered it a sacrifice. That's what marriage was supposed to be. At least that's what I believed. "You'll never regret this," Ryan told me one night as we sat at our kitchen table surrounded by unpaid invoices. He squeezed my hand. "When this company succeeds, it'll belong to both of us." Back then, I believed every word. The success came slowly. Then suddenly, within 4 years, Ryan's company had grown from 6 employees to nearly 50. Contracts became larger. Money became easier. And somewhere during that transition, Ryan changed. At first it was small things. Longer work hours. Business trips. Secretive phone calls. A new luxury truck. Then came the expensive watches, the designer clothes. The sudden obsession with appearances. The man who once laughed at country club memberships was suddenly joining one. The husband who used to rush home for dinner now seemed annoyed whenever I called. I kept telling myself it was stress. Success brings pressure. That's normal. Right. Then Vanessa arrived. 29 years old. Confident. Attractive. Recently hired as office manager. Ryan mentioned her casually at first. Then constantly. Vanessa said this. Vanessa suggested that. Vanessa organized an event. Vanessa helped secure a contract. Every conversation somehow led back to Vanessa. One evening I looked up from my dinner plate and realized he had spent 10 straight minutes talking about her. Not us. Not our future. Not our family. Her. I remember forcing a smile. Trying not to feel foolish. Trying not to sound jealous. But something inside me had already started to worry. 6 months later I found the first charge. A luxury hotel. 300 miles away. Weekend dates. No business conference. No client meetings. No explanation. When I asked Ryan about it, he laughed. Accounting error. I wanted to believe him. So I did. Then came another charge. And another. And another. The lies became harder to ignore. Eventually, I stopped looking for excuses. One rainy Thursday evening, while Ryan showered upstairs, his phone lit up on the kitchen counter. A message appeared on the screen. I wasn't trying to snoop. But I saw enough. Can't wait until this is over. Then we can finally be together. My hands started shaking. The sender's name was Vanessa. I felt sick. Completely sick. When Ryan came downstairs, I showed him the phone. I expected denial. Maybe shame. Instead, he looked relieved. As if a burden had been lifted. "As long as we're being honest," he said, "I haven't been happy for a long time." The sentence nearly destroyed me. 11 years. Reduced to one sentence. One convenient sentence. A week later, I learned I was pregnant. and for a brief moment I thought maybe everything could still be saved. I was wrong. Because when I told Ryan about the baby, he didn't smile. He didn't hug me. He didn't celebrate. Instead, he stared at me across the kitchen and said something I will never forget. Something that hurt more than the affair itself. And that was the moment my marriage truly died. The moment my marriage truly died was not when I discovered the affair. It was not when I found the hotel charges. It was not even when I read Vanessa's message. It was what Ryan said after I told him I was pregnant. He looked at me for a long time. No smile. No excitement. No emotion at all. Then he said, "The timing is awfully convenient." At first I did not understand. What? The pregnancy? I stared at him. Ryan leaned back against the kitchen counter. "You suddenly tell me you're pregnant right after finding out about Vanessa." The room seemed to tilt. "You think I'm lying. I think people do desperate things when they're losing someone." I felt as if all the air had been sucked out of my lungs. "Ryan," he looked away. "I want a paternity test." I still remember those exact words. Not because they were loud, because they were calm, almost casual, as if he were discussing a utility bill. That was the night I stopped begging him to stay. Because I finally understood something. The man standing in front of me was no longer the man I married. Maybe he hadn't been for a long time. The divorce filing arrived 2 weeks later. Ryan moved into a luxury apartment downtown. Vanessa practically moved in with him immediately. People tried to be kind. Friends brought casseroles. Neighbors checked on me. My sister called every evening. But there are some heartbreaks nobody can carry for you. You have to survive them yourself. I focused on work, doctor appointments, preparing the nursery, getting through each day, 1 day at a time, 1 hour at a time, sometimes 1 minute at a time. The baby became my anchor. Every kick reminded me that I still had someone depending on me, someone innocent, someone worth fighting for. 3 months after Ryan moved out, strange things began happening. At first they seemed small, little inconsistencies, financial details that didn't make sense. As an accountant, numbers had always been my language, and Ryan's numbers suddenly sounded wrong. The company that once appeared wildly successful was somehow showing less profit. Several valuable assets had disappeared from financial statements. Certain debts seemed unusually large, almost manufactured. When I questioned Ryan's attorney during preliminary disclosures, I received vague answers. Missing paperwork, pending valuations, administrative delays. The explanations felt slippery. Margaret noticed it too. One afternoon, she spread dozens of documents across a conference table. "Something stinks here," I nodded. "I know." "What do you know?" "I know Ryan." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" "He never leaves money on the table." That was true. Ryan had many flaws. Carelessness was never one of them. If money had vanished, it had not vanished accidentally. Then came the first major hearing. Ryan arrived with Vanessa, not waiting in the hallway, not sitting quietly in the back, actually sitting beside him, as though she were already his wife. I remember walking into the courthouse and seeing them together. She was laughing. Ryan was smiling. For a moment, neither noticed me. I should have felt angry. Instead, I felt strangely calm. The kind of calm that arrives when a wound has already scarred over. The judge ordered Vanessa to move to the spectator section. She looked irritated. Ryan looked embarrassed. The hearing itself accomplished very little. Arguments, documents, deadlines, more paperwork. But afterwards, something happened that stayed with me. As people left the courtroom, Vanessa walked past me. She paused, smiled, then said quietly, "You should probably start getting used to your new budget." I looked at her. "What does that mean?" Her smile widened. "You'll find out." Then she walked away. At the time, I thought she was just being cruel. Now I know she was giving away far more than she realized. A month later, Margaret called me into her office. She had a stack of financial records on her desk. Her expression was serious, not alarmed, worse, focused. "You need to see this." I sat down. Margaret pushed several documents toward me. "Look at the dates." I did. Transfers. Large transfers. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. Moving between unfamiliar entities. LLCs I had never heard of. Consulting firms with no obvious business purpose. Holding companies registered in other states. The transactions all shared one thing. They began shortly before Ryan filed for divorce. My stomach tightened. "He moved the money." Margaret folded her hands. "I think so." "Can we prove it?" "Not yet." That answer terrified me. Because proving something and knowing something are very different things. For weeks, the investigation crawled forward. Document requests, supoenas, bank records, corporate filings. Every answer seemed to create 3 new questions. Meanwhile, Ryan acted increasingly confident. Too confident. Almost cheerful, as though he already knew how everything would end. That confidence bothered Margaret. It bothered me too, because innocent people worry. Ryan wasn't worried, not even a little. Then 6 days before the final divorce hearing, everything changed. A woman neither of us had ever met called Margaret's office. She refused to speak over the phone, refused to explain anything. She only left a message, a single sentence. "My name is Linda Brooks. I worked for Ryan Carter, and I can prove what he did." 6 days later, she delivered 3 boxes of documents. And on the morning Vanessa slapped me in court, those documents landed on Judge Harrison's desk. Back in the sealed courtroom, the judge looked toward the witness stand. The bailiff opened a side door. An older woman with silver hair stepped inside carrying a thick binder. She looked nervous, but determined. Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses. "Please state your name for the record." The woman sat down. Then she took a deep breath. "My name is Linda Brooks." She glanced directly at Ryan, and Ryan's face turned completely white. Linda Brooks looked nothing like the kind of witness who changes lives. She was 62 years old, dressed in a navy cardigan and sensible shoes. Her silver hair was cut short. Reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck. If I had passed her in a grocery store, I would have assumed she was a retired teacher or a grandmother buying ingredients for Sunday dinner. Instead, she was sitting in a sealed courtroom holding evidence that could destroy everything Ryan had spent years building. Judge Harrison nodded toward her. "Ms. Brooks, how were you employed by Carter Construction?" Linda cleared her throat. "I served as chief financial officer for 11 years. A silence settled over the room. Even Ryan's attorney looked surprised. I glanced toward Ryan. He was staring at Linda as if he had seen a ghost. For the first time since our divorce began, he looked genuinely afraid. "How long have you been retired?" the judge asked. 3 months. "And why are you here today?" Linda hesitated. The answer clearly mattered to her. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled slightly. "Because I should have spoken sooner." No one interrupted. "I spent years telling myself that certain things weren't my business. Then I told myself I needed the paycheck. Then I told myself someone else would eventually do the right thing." She lowered her eyes. "But eventually I couldn't live with it anymore." The courtroom remained completely silent. I found myself liking her immediately. Not because she was perfect, because she wasn't. She sounded like a real person. Someone who had struggled with a difficult choice. Someone who regretted waiting too long. Many people in their 60s and 70s understand that feeling better than anyone. Judge Harrison leaned forward. "What exactly couldn't you live with, Ms. Brooks?" Linda opened her binder. "The lies." For the next hour, Linda carefully walked the court through Ryan's financial records. Not complicated legal theories. Facts. Dates. Transfers. Signatures. Paper trails. The kind of evidence accountants trust because numbers rarely care about excuses. According to Linda, the scheme had started nearly 18 months earlier. Long before Ryan filed for divorce. Long before I even knew about Vanessa. The realization made my stomach tighten. This had not been a sudden decision. It had been a plan. A long one. Linda displayed records showing money moving through multiple LLCs. Several existed only on paper. Some were registered to old friends. Others were linked to distant relatives. Each transfer looked legitimate by itself. Together they painted a very different picture. Ryan had been quietly moving assets out of reach. Judge Harrison reviewed document after document. Ryan's attorney objected repeatedly. Most objections failed. The records were simply too detailed. Too complete. Too organized. Someone had spent years maintaining them. And that someone had been sitting in the company's accounting department the entire time. Watching. Waiting. Collecting. Remembering. Then Linda reached a section that changed everything. She placed several pages on the evidence screen. I watched Vanessa's expression immediately change. The signatures at the bottom were hers. Judge Harrison noticed too. "Ms. Brooks." Linda adjusted her glasses. "Several transactions required dual authorization. Meaning Mr. Carter did not act alone." Vanessa sat up straight. "I don't know anything about those." Linda looked directly at her. Not angrily, simply honestly. "Your signature appears on every approval." Vanessa's face flushed. "I signed whatever Ryan told me to sign." Ryan whipped his head toward her. His eyes narrowed. That small reaction told me more than any testimony could. The cracks were finally starting to appear. For months, Vanessa had carried herself like the winner, the younger woman, the chosen woman, the future wife, the woman who believed she had taken my place. Now she looked less confident, less certain, almost frightened. Judge Harrison noticed it too. "Ms. Brooks, in your opinion, what was the purpose of these transactions?" Linda answered immediately. "To reduce the appearance of marital assets before divorce proceedings." The words landed like a hammer. Ryan's attorney stood. "Objection. Sustained as to opinion," the judge replied. Then he turned back to Linda. "Can you testify regarding the effect of the transactions?" "Yes." "What effect did they have?" Linda didn't hesitate. "They made Mr. Carter appear substantially less wealthy than he actually was." That objection never came, because everyone knew it was true. As the hearing continued, I found myself watching Ryan more than the witness. Not because I loved him anymore, because I was trying to understand him. When had this started? When had protecting money become more important than protecting his family? When had winning become more important than being decent? The questions had no easy answers. Perhaps they never would. What hurt most was realizing that some part of this plan had existed even before the affair. The betrayal had started long before Vanessa, long before divorce, long before any courtroom. Then Linda revealed the document that changed the entire atmosphere. It was dated only 2 weeks before the divorce hearing. Recent. Very recent. Judge Harrison examined it carefully. His eyebrows lifted. For the first time all day, he seemed genuinely surprised. Ryan looked down. Vanessa looked confused. I looked at Margaret. Margaret was smiling. Just barely. The document showed something devastating. Not only had Ryan hidden assets, he had personally signed sworn financial disclosures stating those assets did not exist. The courtroom went completely still. Even Ryan's attorney closed his eyes for a moment, because everyone understood the same thing at exactly the same time. This was no longer about clever accounting. This was no longer about divorce strategy. This was about lying directly to the court, and Judge Harrison looked very, very unhappy. The next morning, local business news websites were already reporting that one of Carter Construction's largest commercial clients had suspended negotiations pending review of the allegations. No criminal charges had been filed. No verdict had been reached. But reputation moves faster than the legal system. And once doubt enters the room, it rarely leaves quietly. Back in the courtroom, Ryan looked as though he had aged 10 years overnight. The confidence he had carried for months was gone. The smug little smiles, the expensive suits, the certainty, all of it had disappeared. Now he looked like a man watching a storm roll toward him with nowhere to run. Judge Harrison reviewed the latest documents, while attorneys whispered urgently at both tables. Finally, Ryan's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, my client requests a brief recess." The judge stared at him. 5 minutes. His gavel struck. 5 minutes. The moment we stepped into the private conference area, Margaret exhaled for what felt like the first time all day. "Well," she said quietly, "that was catastrophic." I almost laughed. "That's your professional opinion." "It is." She sat beside me. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. I rubbed my stomach. The baby shifted gently. Lately, those little movements had become my reminder that life continued outside courtrooms and legal filings. Outside betrayal. Outside anger. Margaret studied me. "How are you holding up?" I considered the question. The honest answer surprised even me. "Better than I expected." "Really?" I nodded. "For months I thought I was crazy." Margaret waited. I knew something was wrong. I knew the numbers didn't make sense. I knew Ryan was hiding things. I looked toward the closed conference room door, but nobody believed me. Margaret's expression softened. "I believed you." "You suspected." She smiled. "Fair." I smiled back. Then my smile faded. At least now I know I wasn't imagining it. That mattered more than I expected, because betrayal often makes people doubt themselves. Not just the other person, themselves. Their judgment, their memory, their instincts. For months, Ryan had made me question all three. Now the truth was finally standing in daylight. Across the hall, Ryan and Vanessa were having a very different conversation. We heard raised voices through the thin walls. Not every word, just enough. "You told me," Vanessa's voice. Then Ryan, "Keep your voice down." Then Vanessa again, louder this time. "I signed what you gave me." The hallway suddenly became quiet. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like trouble." I said nothing, because for the first time their problems no longer felt like mine. When court resumed, the atmosphere had changed completely. Judge Harrison looked even less patient than before. Ryan's attorney looked exhausted, and Vanessa looked terrified. The judge adjusted his glasses. Mr. Carter, before we proceed further, I would like clarification regarding the sworn disclosures submitted to this court. Ryan swallowed. Yes, Your Honor. Did you personally review these disclosures before signing them? His attorney immediately shifted in his chair. I knew why. It was a dangerous question. If Ryan said no, he appeared reckless. If Ryan said yes, the documents became his responsibility. Ryan hesitated. Too long. Everyone noticed. Yes. Judge Harrison nodded slowly. So your testimony is that you reviewed these statements and believed them to be accurate. Ryan's attorney closed his eyes. Just briefly, but I saw it. So did Margaret. The answer had trapped him. The hearing continued for another 2 hours. Witnesses, documents, financial summaries, expert testimony. Piece by piece, the picture became clearer. Ryan had spent over a year moving assets, not because he needed to, not because the business was failing, because he wanted control. He wanted to decide what I received, what I deserved, what our child deserved. And he had assumed nobody would ever discover it. Then another surprise arrived. One of the suspended clients had submitted a statement to the court. The company had worked with Ryan for nearly 7 years. Millions of dollars in contracts. A strong business relationship. Now they were reviewing whether future projects would continue. The statement itself was short, professional, polite, but its meaning was devastating. Trust had been damaged, and in business trust is often worth more than money. I glanced toward Ryan. He looked physically ill. For the first time, I wondered if he finally understood what he had done. Not to me, to himself. Then came the moment that finally shattered whatever remained between him and Vanessa. Judge Harrison reviewed several email records connected to the transactions. One message was particularly revealing. Ryan had written, "Once the divorce is finished, everything will be ours." Vanessa stared at the screen. I watched her face change, confusion, then realization, then anger. Real anger. Not the performative confidence she had shown for months. Something deeper. Because she had finally discovered what I already knew. Ryan had spent years telling people exactly what they wanted to hear. Me, his employees, his clients, her. The only difference was that now she was experiencing it herself. She turned toward him. "You promised me." The words escaped before she could stop them. The courtroom went silent. Ryan stared straight ahead. He did not answer. Vanessa laughed bitterly, a short broken sound. And suddenly she looked less like a villain and more like another person who had trusted the wrong man. Then Ryan slowly turned toward my table. His eyes met mine. Not with arrogance, not with anger, not even with defeat. Something else. Regret. For the first time in a very long time. The hearing adjourned shortly afterward. As people gathered documents and prepared to leave, Ryan approached Margaret. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Can I speak to Emily?" Margaret looked at me. The choice was mine. And after everything that had happened, I wasn't sure whether I wanted to hear a single word he had to say. I spent most of my life believing that closure came from answers. Age has a way of teaching you otherwise. Sometimes closure comes from accepting that the answers arrived too late. Margaret and I remained in the conference room while everyone else slowly filtered out of the courtroom. She watched me carefully. "You don't have to do this." "I know. Whatever he wants to say can wait." I looked down at my hands. For months I had imagined this moment. The day Ryan finally realized what he had thrown away. The day he regretted it. The day he apologized. Yet now that it had arrived, I felt strangely empty. Not angry. Not satisfied. Just tired. "I'm not doing it for him," I finally said. Margaret nodded. "Then do it for yourself." 10 minutes later, Ryan stepped into the room. Alone. No attorney. No Vanessa. No audience. Just the two people who had once stood together in a small church and promised forever. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He looked older than I remembered. Not physically. Emotionally. Like someone carrying a weight he could no longer hide. Finally, he sat across from me. "Thank you for agreeing to talk." I nodded. "Nothing more." Ryan stared at the table. Then he laughed quietly. Not because anything was funny. Because he didn't know where to begin. I had this whole speech prepared. I said nothing. And now I can't remember any of it. For the first time in years, he looked completely honest. Not charming. Not persuasive. Not confident. Just honest. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "Good." The word came out before I could stop it. Ryan nodded slowly. I deserve that. Another silence followed. Then he surprised me. He didn't blame Vanessa. He didn't blame stress. He didn't blame success. He didn't blame anybody. Instead, he said the one thing I never expected to hear. This is my fault. I stared at him. Ryan continued. I kept telling myself I was building something. His eyes drifted toward the window. The company, the money, the future. He swallowed. And somewhere along the way I started treating people like obstacles. The room became very quiet. Not clients. Not employees. His voice cracked slightly. My family. For a brief second I saw the man I married. Not the man he became. The man he used to be. And somehow that hurt even more. Do you know what I kept thinking about last night? He asked. No. The nursery. I blinked. Ryan smiled sadly. The one we painted yellow because you couldn't decide between blue and green. I remembered. That had been years ago. Back when we still believed we'd have children sooner. Back when life felt simpler. Ryan looked down. I walked away from everything that mattered. The old version of me might have cried. The woman I had become simply listened. Because regret does not erase damage. It only acknowledges it. And sometimes even that comes too late. The divorce settlement was finalized 3 weeks later. Not perfectly. No divorce ever is. But fairly. The hidden assets were included. The financial disclosures were corrected. The legal process continued regarding the false filings. And for the first time in nearly a year, I stopped living from crisis to crisis. I began preparing for my son's arrival. The crib was assembled. The tiny clothes were washed. The hospital bag was packed. Life moved forward. Slowly. But it moved. 3 weeks after the settlement, labor began. At first I thought it was indigestion. Then the contractions started. Then they became impossible to ignore. My sister drove me to Riverside Medical Center just before dawn. Outside the sky was still dark. Inside everything smelled like disinfectant and coffee. The labor lasted 14 hours, the longest 14 hours of my life. When my son finally arrived crying loudly and angrily at the world, I cried too. Not because I was scared. Because we had made it. Through all of it. The affair. The divorce. The courtroom. The humiliation. The uncertainty. We had made it. The nurse placed him in my arms. And in that moment nothing else mattered. Not Ryan. Not Vanessa. Not money. Not court. Only him. The next afternoon a quiet knock sounded at the hospital door. I already knew who it was. Ryan stepped inside. He looked nervous. More nervous than I had ever seen him. His eyes immediately found the baby. Our son. The room fell silent. Slowly I nodded toward the chair beside the bed. Ryan sat down. For several minutes he simply stared. The tiny fingers. The little nose. The soft blanket wrapped around him. Then tears appeared. Real tears, not dramatic ones. The kind people try unsuccessfully to hide. I missed everything. His voice barely worked. I remained silent. Ryan swallowed hard. I missed every kick. Another pause. Every appointment. He wiped his eyes. Every chance to be a father. The room became so quiet I could hear the monitor beside my bed. I looked at him, and for the first time in a long time I did not feel anger. I felt sadness. Because some mistakes cost more than money. More than careers. More than reputations. Some mistakes steal moments you can never get back. And Ryan was finally beginning to understand exactly what his had cost him. A year later my life looked nothing like I had imagined during those dark months leading up to the divorce. And that turned out to be a good thing. Not because everything was perfect. Because it was real. The drama had faded. The court hearings had ended. The lawyers had moved on to other cases. The headlines about Ryan's company had disappeared. Life had settled into something quieter. Something better. Something honest. My son Ethan had just celebrated his first birthday. He had my eyes, Ryan's stubbornness, and a laugh that could instantly improve the worst day. Most mornings started before sunrise. Breakfast. Diapers. Coffee. More diapers. Parenthood was exhausting. But unlike the stress I had lived with during my marriage, this kind of exhaustion came with joy. The kind that filled a house instead of draining it. The kind that reminded me what mattered. I had returned to work 6 months earlier. Not because I needed to. Because I wanted to. For years I had helped build someone else's future. Now I was building my own. I joined a regional accounting firm that specialized in helping small family-owned businesses. The work felt meaningful. Many of my clients were people close to my age. Some older. People who had spent decades building something they hoped to pass on to children and grandchildren. People who understood that trust mattered more than shortcuts, more than greed, more than appearances. Every so often one of them would tell me a story about betrayal, a failed partnership, a dishonest relative, a business dispute. And every time I found myself repeating the same lesson. The truth may take time, but it eventually catches up with everyone. Ryan's life had changed too. The company survived. Barely. Several major contracts disappeared. Some employees left. A few longtime clients never returned. The legal consequences of the false disclosures followed him for months. Financially, he recovered. Professionally, he recovered. But certain things never fully returned. Trust among them. Ironically, that seemed to be the lesson that affected him most. Not the money, the trust. Because once people stop believing you, rebuilding that faith takes years, sometimes longer. Vanessa disappeared from our lives almost immediately after the divorce ended. I heard she moved to another state, started a new job, eventually began dating someone else. I never spoke to her again. And honestly, I didn't want to. Not because I hated her. Because she no longer mattered. One of the strangest parts of healing is realizing that some people simply stop occupying space in your mind. Vanessa became one of those people. A chapter. Not the story. Ryan, however, remained part of my life because of Ethan. At first, co-parenting felt awkward, uncomfortable, carefully scripted. Everything happened through text messages, schedules, pickups, doctor appointments, birthdays. No unnecessary conversation. No personal discussions. Just parenting. Over time, though, something changed. Not romance. Not reconciliation. Respect. Slowly. Carefully. Earned one interaction at a time. Ryan never missed a visitation. Never missed a birthday. Never missed a pediatrician appointment again. The man who once abandoned those responsibilities seemed determined not to repeat that mistake. Perhaps guilt motivated him. Perhaps love did. Maybe both. Either way, Ethan benefited. And that was enough for me. One Saturday afternoon, Ryan dropped Ethan off after a weekend visit. It was early fall, the same season when my marriage had collapsed 2 years earlier. The air smelled like leaves and wood smoke. Ethan toddled across the lawn toward me, laughing. I scooped him up. He wrapped both arms around my neck. Behind him, Ryan stood beside his truck, watching, smiling. The sadness was still there. I could see it, but it no longer defined him. Parenthood did. As Ethan chased Bubbles across the yard, Ryan remained near the driveway, almost as though he wanted to say something. Finally, he did. Emily, I turned. He looked nervous, which was unusual. Yeah. For several seconds, he simply stood there. Then he said quietly, "Thank you." I frowned. For what? Ryan glanced toward Ethan. For not teaching him to hate me. The words hung in the autumn air. Simple, honest, painfully sincere. I looked at my son, then back at Ryan, and suddenly I understood something. Forgiveness isn't always about forgetting. Sometimes it's about refusing to pass pain to the next generation. I smiled softly. He deserves a better father than the one you were. Ryan lowered his eyes. Then I added, not a worse one. His face tightened. For a moment I thought he might cry. Instead, he nodded, the way people do when they finally hear a truth they've spent years avoiding. Then he quietly thanked me again, and drove away. That evening, after Ethan fell asleep, I sat alone on the back porch, the same way my father used to. The neighborhood was quiet. The sky glowed orange and purple above the trees. And for the first time in a very long time, I thought about everything that had happened without feeling bitterness. The affair, the lies, the courtroom, the slap, the humiliation, the fear. All of it had shaped me, but none of it defined me. The greatest victory wasn't exposing Ryan. It wasn't winning the divorce. It wasn't recovering the money. The greatest victory was refusing to become the kind of person his betrayal could have turned me into. Because character matters more than wealth. Children should never be used as weapons in adult conflicts. And the truth, no matter how delayed, always leaves its mark. If you've ever faced betrayal, heartbreak, or a moment when life seemed impossible to rebuild, I hope this story reminds you that healing is possible. Sometimes slowly, sometimes painfully, but possible. And if this story spoke to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your experience in the comments, and if you'd like more stories about resilience, family forgiveness, and finding strength after life's hardest moments, please consider subscribing. Thank you for spending this time with me.